Okay, this is the pre-roll for Sunday, October 8th. I'll give the Hebrew date as we go live. We'll be streaming on both Sabbath.tv and Facebook Live. First, let's go to Sabbath.tv. Good morning to those of you watching on Sabbath.tv. I'll explain the date and a few things after we go live on Facebook Live as well. Let me hit the button over here. And greetings to those of you watching on Facebook Live. This is Sunday morning, October 8, 2017, the fourth day of the Feast of Tabernacles, which means on God's holy sacred calendar that would make it the 18th day of the 7th month, because as many of you know, the Leviticus 23 tells us the Feast of Tabernacles begins on the 15th of the 7th month, and so on the 18th, 15, 16, 17, 18, that makes us the fourth day of the Feast of Tabernacles. We're now 4 times, what did I figure the other day? 123 was it? 143, so almost 150. So we're a little more than 550 years into the millennium, symbolically, as we go through the Feast of Tabernacles. Because by the end of the Feast of Tabernacles, the 1,000 years of the millennium will have passed, and then we hit the last great day, an event that occurs after the millennium, when the billions of people that have lived and were not called in the spring harvest, they're calling for the fall harvest. They're awakened to it in a second resurrection of billions of people as we've prepared through the millennium for that big occasion that follows after this Feast of Tabernacles ends, immediately after. Sunset after the 7th day of the Feast of Tabernacles, the last great day begins. And the last great day is an annual Sabbath. It is a holy day, so don't anybody be taking off early. Don't cut out of the feast early, because the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles is a holy day, but the last day of the feast is not. It's the day after the last day of the feast, the last great day, the 8th day of the feast, which is outside the Feast of Tabernacles, and yet it's because it adjoins it, it's considered part of the Feast of Tabernacles season. And in that respect, so are trumpets and atonement considered part of the Feast of Tabernacles season, all part of the fall season, the third of 3 times or 3 seasons, as God mentions it in Deuteronomy 16:16. But brethren, what we have for you today is a very special behind the feast film. And I should apologize for our being late this morning and explain to you why. We lost our electricity this morning because of that storm activity, and let's update that. We have reason to give thanks to God for the storm weakening. We're talking about Tropical Storm Nate, N-A-T-E, Nate. It weakened when it hit the United States shores, it weakened after hitting the United States shores. I've got the news story on that. Let me advance. Let me come in here with you just a little bit, and let's advance. Now, Mr. Armstrong will be speaking from 1985, but before we get there, this is me, Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth, speaking to you. Let me advance this to some news stories. Oh, I think I forgot to advance it to the next day on our player, so let me tell you what, let's go over here for just a moment on this side while I take that player out and put it back with the correct day's stuff on it, with the stuff for today. Just bear with me a moment. I got everything already in the system. It's just I got to switch days. I had yesterday's. We accidentally brought up yesterday's date with all the stuff happening with the storm activity. All right, let's see what we have now. I've got these set for the feast film, so it may squeeze these pictures just a little bit, but let's take a look at what we got. Get this lower third totally out of the way. And the caption with this photograph from the BBC says some 300 guests are in the Golden Nugget hotel in Biloxi, Mississippi, where Storm Nate has brought strong winds, heavy rain, and some flooding to the southeastern United States. It made landfall as a hurricane twice in Louisiana and Mississippi, but is now weakening rapidly. Hooray for your prayers, those of you who prayed that God would tone that down, as some of the brethren on the coastal areas of the United States, especially in Alabama and Florida, where it was first predicted to come in there strongly, were putting out pleas for prayers that God would weaken that. I did pray as you asked, and of course with good reason for me too. Birmingham is right in the pathway of the predicted pathway, and which it was going to come up Tornado Alley, and I live in that Tornado Alley, so we've often had to call on God's intervention and protection here, just from where we live, from normal natural things. But the BBC tells us this: some strong surge warnings have been lifted, but weather officials say danger remains in Alabama and western Florida. Nate killed at least 25 people in Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Honduras. No deaths or injuries have been reported in the United States, although not as strong as last month's Maria or Irma. Louisiana and Mississippi, Alabama, and parts of Florida had issued warnings and evacuation orders ahead of its arrival. Film footage from Biloxi showed flooded streets and highways. This photograph that I have here, we showed you at the beginning, shows that hotel in Biloxi with flooding there. Let's see, I've got some more notes from the BBC on this. Chet Harrison, the manager of the Golden Nugget Hotel and Casino in Biloxi, said he had kept a restaurant and bar open for his 300 guests, and they've been okay so far. Now, friends, we just lost our power again for a moment. I've got emergency backup that kicks in, but I don't know what it does for the... Yeah, we've got it on the modem as well, so I think we're still transmitting. However, we just lost all our monitors in the studio, and I've got them on emergency also, but they lose their signal. So let me see if I can carefully, if I'm going to be able to bring this back for us. Let's try this. See if... All right, I got that back. Stop outputting before closing. No, we don't really want to close that. All right, let me check and see if we've still got a green light on Facebook. Oh, well, all right, we lost our Facebook video. Let's see if we can bring that back. How come we lost that? You may still have audio, but I've got this funny screen going on. Let's see what we got here. Let me try a couple things. Those of you on Sabbath.tv, I think you're still getting our signal. Oh, I know what it is. Stand by. We'll have you a signal back on Facebook Live in just a moment. I just have to cycle this. Okie doke. All right. That was just a short interruption in our signal, in our power, I mean. So, all right, we got the video back on Facebook Live. All right, and I got the monitors back in the studio so I can see what's going on. All right, we are under storm weather conditions here. Now, I was telling you about what the manager at the Biloxi Hotel said. He told local television he hoped none of the guests tried to leave the hotel because everything is flooded around us. The mayor of nearby Gulfport, Billy Hughes, told the BBC the storm surge did not appear to be as high as feared, and he thought the damage there would be minimal. Mississippi emergency official Greg Flynn told AP, and by the way, all this is right up to the moment, friends. I've got a live feed from BBC they're giving me here on these notes. Greg Flynn told Associated Press that more than 1,000. Now, if you're watching from the archive, I'm saying this is up to the moment if you're watching us on the live stream. But if you're watching a recording from the archive later, of course, this is going to be old news. But at this moment, Greg Flynn told Associated Press that more than 1,000 people in the state spent the night in shelters, but no major damage had been reported. In southern Alabama, the local power company said some 5,000 people were without power. Now, that's southern Alabama, but here in central Alabama, our electricity is going off, coming back on, going off, coming back on. So I need to get Mr. Armstrong's behind the work film started soon in case we get totally knocked out here later. I'll from the time we get knocked out, I'll have about a half hour of emergency power. And then I've got the gasoline emergency power I can kick in, but when I switch that, everything goes off for a few seconds. So hopefully we can get on. Hopefully we're not going to lose our power until end of our live stream today, because I've got an outstanding behind the works film where Mr. Armstrong, as I was mentioning yesterday, really trumpets out the truth about the prophecy God gave us through Ezekiel in chapter 6, verse 6, that if the modern-day descendants of Joseph, his two sons, Ephraim in the UK, Manasseh in the United States, if we don't repent of our rebellion, our disobedience to God, and yes, sin comes very natural. It's something people want to do, they want to excuse, and if they don't repent of it, God considers them stiff-necked, stubborn, and rebellious. And he says if we continue in that rebellion, we'll wind up in captivity after losing 2/3 of our people in nuclear attacks that lay waste all of the cities of the United States. Now, it'll kill 1/3 of the people by direct hit. Those people that are a little further out from the cities, it'll kill a second third by disease epidemics and famine, because the food and the air will be contaminated with high nuclear radiation. That'll kill a second third of the people. The third who live further out in the suburbs or countries, they'll get a little bit sick from it all, and they'll be taken captive. And many of them will die in captivity. God's end-time apostle Herbert Armstrong has understood and by inspiration has explained to us the hairs that remained in the skirt of Ezekiel represent about 10% of the total population. So 10% of 7 billion? Yeah, 10% of 7 billion people would leave about 700 million, 10%, who will live on over into the world tomorrow after Jesus Christ returns, which the Feast of Trumpets on the first of the 7th month pictures. I'll come back to this news story in a moment on the weather, but let me just digress for this moment as we segue toward Mr. Armstrong's behind the video film that mentions Ezekiel. And the Feast of Trumpets pictures Christ's return 9 days later, on the 10th of the 7th month. He puts away Satan. Now, someone on social media was asking the other day, and I was kind of wanting to give an answer, but it wasn't on my post, it was on somebody else's. But they asked the question, they said, well, what happens between atonement and Feast of Tabernacles? They said, we know Christ returns on trumpets, he puts away Satan on atonement. What happens between atonement and when the Feast of Tabernacles begins? Well, I have a thought on that. The only thing I can find in the Bible related to that is the scriptures about how the high priest, after the two goats, we're talking about it between atonement and tabernacles, what happens after the high priest takes the goat that the lot he cast the lot on the two goats, and the goat that's to be slain, after he slays that goat, then he takes the other goat out to the wilderness. Now that goat that's slain, we all understand. Hopefully you understand, and that's Jesus Christ's sacrifice, which he has done. What's left to be done is that second goat taken to the wilderness. Christ on atonement, the two goats, they picture, the second goat pictures, the Azazel goat pictures Christ, the strong man, taking the devil, and that includes all his demons, all his host of demons too, to the wilderness where he's let go. In other words, he's taken to the bottomless pit. The door is closed for 1,000 years. He's sealed and locked into that bottomless pit, that hole of blackness, for 1,000 years. Then released for a little season, and then back he goes again, but this time permanently, sealed up, never to be seen again. But the example of the high priest under the Levitical priesthood, after he took the second goat, the goat that represents the Azazel, to the wilderness to let him go, he had to come back and bathe himself and those clothes, because he was filthy from the contact with the devil. This is what that pictures. And so Christ has, between atonement and Feast of Tabernacles, he has the 10th to the 15th, he has 5 days. And since the symbol is a shadow of picturing what's coming, the high priest having to clean up after having taken the goat that represents the devil to the desert, if the symbolism holds there, Christ is going to come back feeling emotionally drained. He's going to feel filthy after having had to strong-arm the devil. Now, the devil's not going to go along easily with being taken off of his throne, even though Christ is qualified to take it over and to usher in and restore the kingdom of God to this earth. Satan had the throne of this earth. He's not going to relinquish it easy. He's more than once will have gone up to God's throne to try to take it over. He did that once before when he got thrown down here, and just before the end he goes up, gets thrown back down, comes down angry. He makes a second attempt to take over God's throne, and not just the earth, but he wants the whole shebang. He wants the universe, God's seat, everything. He tries one more time, he gets thrown back down here. And when Christ returns, and then on atonement, when he returns on trumpets, and then on atonement, when Christ takes Satan goes to Satan to take him off that throne, Satan's not going to just come down off the throne and say, "Okay, you got me. I'll go along freely with you." No, he's going to put up a huge fight, and that's going to take a lot of strength on Christ's part. Now, Christ has that strength, but he's got to use that strength. Remember when the woman touched the hem of Christ's garment, having the faith that if she could just touch his garment, she could be healed? And with that faith, that happened for her. But Christ felt that. He turned around and said, "Who touched me?" And he explains, I felt an essence, the Spirit go out of me. And he has to go back to the Father to have that replenished. He felt that go out of him. And after he takes Satan away, there's going to be a lot drawn out of him. He helped create that being before that being rebelled, when he was Lucifer, the bright and shining star of the morning, when he was a beautiful being. And just like brethren, you or me, or people, neighbors, somebody who has an animal they love, it becomes part of their family. If it gets old, or if it gets, for some reason, something bites it and it gets rabies and it goes mad, or it just gets old and maybe gets cancer or gets cranky, and it has to be put to death, the people are in tears. The family are oftentimes in tears over the loss of that animal, that family member. Well, Lucifer Satan is like an animal to God, a family member animal, loved. And even though he rebelled, they created him. He became a Frankenstein monster, yes, turned against its own creator. But its creator who created him was one of the most beautiful beings. They loved him. They put a lot into him. There's probably still some emotional feeling regarding back to the time they created him so most beautiful. And it's been a long hurt that Satan rebelled against his creator. And when Christ has to take him off the throne and take him away, you know, that wasn't in the original plan, and they really didn't want to have to do that. And when Christ has to do that, the plan is changed, and they're ready for the change, but it's still going to have some emotional impact on Christ. He's going to come back emotionally very drained. He's going to feel filthy since Lucifer turned into the devil. And Christ is, with that contact with the devil, Christ is going to feel that hatred, that evil characteristic and qualities of Satan. Qualities, I mean lack of qualities. He's going to feel all that evil. And brethren, those of us who've had to resist and overcome Satan, we're still, some of us, fighting Satan and that influence of Satan. You know how strong that influence can be, especially with the flesh that desires to do certain evil, that God just made us subject to that for the purpose of our overcoming and building character. Now, some of us are falling short on that, and we need to make some dramatic improvements on that. But my thoughts relate to, the only thing I can find on the Bible that relates to what happens between Atonement and Feast of Tabernacles, those 5 days, is Christ is going to have to clean himself up after feeling so emotionally drained and dirty from having had to, by force, take Satan off that throne. If you've watched anybody who's ever had to make an arrest, even in this world, after they've arrested someone and the person puts up a fight and all this, the officer who had to do the arrest, especially in the bigger, horrible type cases, oftentimes feels emotionally drained. He feels pretty horrible having had to arrest someone who puts up a big fight. And, you know, taking away their freedom from them and putting them in a system that's going to punish them, you know, whether it's fairly done or not fairly done. The arresting officer often feels bad, feels dirty. Christ is going to feel that way. He's got 5 days to recover with the Father's help. and who knows? I can't find it described anywhere in there exactly when the marriage ceremony occurs after Christ returns. You know, he's crowned, as Mr. Armstrong has understood and explained to us, he's crowned as King of Kings and Lords of Lords in a coronation ceremony in heaven before he returns. So that happens before we see him, that he gets the crown as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. But somewhere after his return and the millennium, we're going to have that marriage supper. Now, it's possible, maybe, because, you know, after Christ returns, he's got to pour out 7 last plagues. Upon his return, he returns with the 7 vials of the 7 last plagues. On the 7th trump, when he returns, that's also known as the third woe. The 7th trump is the third woe. Christ returns on the 7th trump. He returns at the beginning of the third woe. The third woe is the same as the 7 last plagues, the pouring out of those 7 last plagues. So he's got that to do between his return on trumpets and atonement. Now, he may still be doing that after atonement. Maybe, I don't know. Is he going to do that in 9 days? Those 9 days strictly symbolic? Pouring out 7 last plagues? How long is that going to last? That happens after he returns, and then on the 10th day, atonement pictures him putting away Satan. And then 5 days, that's 10 days after he returns. Then 5 days after atonement, after putting away Satan, the Feast of Tabernacles, 15th of the 7th month begins. And so maybe in between, there's only a maybe. I mean, I'm just thinking, we are to meditate on things and think. And so please don't anybody say, Gilbert says that we're going to get married to Christ between Atonement and the Tabernacles. No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying think about that's a possibility. I probably should not have even brought that part up. But we do know the high priest had to clean himself up after he took the Azazel goat to the desert. And symbolically, Christ may have to do the same thing. And that may be the big thing he's doing between Atonement and the beginning of Tabernacles, and why there's some days in between those events, so that Christ can recover, clean up and recover emotionally from dragging the devil and all his demons off the thrones of this earth and placing him into the bottomless pit, which the wilderness pictured that the Azazel goat was put into. Okay, back to the rest of this news story, and then we'll start Mr. Armstrong's the Behind the Work from 1985, in which Mr. Armstrong pounds out his explanation and truth about Ezekiel 6:6 being for our day to day. It had to be a time after the atomic and hydrogen bombs were created, weapons powerful enough to destroy an entire city, with the atomic bomb simply being the trigger for the much greater hydrogen bomb. A hydrogen bomb can't go off without the heat, the immense and momentous and booming heat of the atomic bomb. But here's some more from the BBC on what's happening weather-wise. A mandatory curfew was lifted in New Orleans, Louisiana, as the threat to the city devastated by Hurricane Katrina in 2005 was downgraded, with Nate being downgraded. Nate was downgraded from a hurricane to a tropical storm by the National Hurricane Center at 9 o'clock Greenwich Mean Time, but its advisory warned of a life-threatening storm surge, flooding, and said alerts remained in effect from the Mississippi-Alabama border to Indian Pass on the Florida Panhandle. Okay, so we got a big potential for flooding, life-threatening storm surge flooding from Mississippi-Alabama border, the Mississippi-Alabama border to Indian Pass on the Florida Panhandle. 5 ports along the Gulf Coast were also closed to shipping as a precaution ahead of Nate's arrival. Most oil and gas platforms in the U.S. Gulf of Mexico also evacuated their staff. The President of the United States, Donald Trump, said yesterday on Sabbath, Saturday, he issued an emergency declaration for Louisiana and Mississippi, allowing the state to seek federal help with preparation and possible relief efforts. And then here's a photograph. The caption with this photograph, friends, let's see if I can get the buttons to work here. The caption reads, "Star Wars fans dressed as stormtroopers walk the streets of New Orleans ahead of Nate's arrival." And then the rest of the story, the BBC information reads like this, friends. Nate caused heavy rains, landslide, and floods which blocked roads, destroyed bridges, and damaged houses. At least 13 people died in Nicaragua, 8 in Honduras, and 1 in El Salvador. The tail of the storms is still causing problems in the region where thousands have been forced to sleep in shelters, and some 400,000 people in Costa Rica were reported to be without running water. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, visiting Antigua and Barbuda which were badly damaged by Hurricane Irma in September, said the international community needed to do more to help Caribbean countries hit by a series of powerful hurricanes. There's an interesting intensity of hurricanes and increasing frequency and increasing devastation, he told the BBC. Now, those are interesting terms the UN Secretary General are using, friends, because the way God's end-time apostle has described what we are to be watching for in those seals from the book of Revelation are for when they increase in frequency and when they increase in intensity. And those are some of the words here used by the United Nations Secretary General. He said, we are facing the consequences. Let's see. I got ahead of myself there. Let me back it up. He said there's an increasing intensity of hurricanes and increasing frequency. Again, those are the two terms Mr. Armstrong used for what we need to watch for in those seals. When they increase in frequency, when they increase in intensity, then they're headed toward blossoming. And like Christ said, when you see the limbs of a tree become tender and the little buds on them begin to blossom, you know that summer is nigh. And then he said, likewise, when you see these seals blossom, when they increase in frequency, when they increase in intensity, you know the kingdom of God is near. The fifth seal is about to kick in, which starts the 3.5-year clock. 3.5 years of great tribulation with the fifth seal, with a sign at the 2.5-year mark into the great tribulation that we're now about to begin the seventh seal, the year-long day of the Lord, the last year of the 3.5 years of devastation from great tribulation. Going back to the comment from the UN Secretary General, he said the origin is clear. We're facing the consequences of, they like to use that political term, climate change, which has gotten a lot of argument and different definings and definitions. God is in control of the weather. I think that's where we need to be thinking, friends. All right, we've covered the up to the moment news. There again is that alert for potential life-threatening storm surge flooding from the Alabama-Mississippi border to the Indian Pass Panhandle in Florida. So for those of you along the coast during the Feast of Tabernacles today, you've got that warning from the National Hurricane Center. All right, let me back this up and we will... Oh, I had one more. There's the video show. There's a map that the BBC produced showing the predicted pathway from Biloxi. It's still coming through Alabama, going northeast up to let's see, it's due in mid-Tennessee. Oh, some of you folks at the feast in Tennessee, it's 1900. It's due there at 1900 on Sunday. That'll be 7 o'clock tonight. It's due your way. Okay, so sometime within the next hour or two, it'll be coming through Alabama. We're quiet now, which, usually just before a big storm, everything gets still and quiet. That's where we are right now. So hopefully we'll get through Mr. Armstrong's his talk, at least covering Ezekiel's comment about from chapter 6, verse 6, about God causing all the cities to be laid waste through his servants, those he uses, that he mentions in Isaiah 10, verses 5 and 6, the modern-day Assyrians. He calls them the rod of his anger, the staff of his indignation that he uses against the people of his wrath. Who are the people of his wrath? They're the people that stood before him at Mount Sinai and said, "Oh, yes, Lord, you be our God, we'll be your people, and we'll obey all of your commands, your judgments, your statutes, your voice." And then they turn right around and have a big orgy and show themselves to be stubborn, rebellious, disobedient. to God. And several times have had to be taken captive. And the prediction for the future, a prediction of prophecy that could not have happened before these latter days, before the invention of the hydrogen bomb, when all your cities could be laid waste. That's a prophecy for us in these latter days today, brethren. And that's for the modern day descendants, especially of Joseph, his two sons, Ephraim in the UK, Manasseh in the US. All of your cities will be laid waste if you don't repent. All right, you'll hear that in this talk. Let me back it on up. See, other way, Stephen, back it up. Oh, I just had one more thing here for those of you that want to know. It was announced as a Category 1 for a while. That's a situation where you've got winds from 74 to 95 miles per hour, some damage and power cuts. I think they've reduced that. I'm not sure where we are in the categories right now, but the latest news is life-threatening storm flooding from the Alabama-Mississippi border to the Indian Pass, Panhandle, Florida. All right, now let's back that up. Okay, what happened? I think, is this it? All right, let me roll just a little bit of it and see if this is, yeah, this is the video we're going to want to go to. So, here we go to the 1985 Behind the Work Festival film or video in which Mr. Armstrong will speak about Ezekiel's prophecy. It's something you can enjoy too. There's some good entertainment in it. This is the Feast of Tabernacles, a time to rejoice. It's the fourth day of the feast, and you'll hear, as you hear Mr. Armstrong, he'll be speaking from 1985 during this 1985 Behind the Work video.
The following is a Worldwide Church of God presentation. In August 1914, Europe erupted in war. For 4 terrible years, the great powers battled each other until they reached a standstill in the fields of France and Belgium. When the conflict was over and the armistice signed, a generation of young men had been slaughtered. Weapons had become so powerful, the destruction so complete. Surely civilization could not survive another war like this. This had to be the war to end all wars. Following the armistice, King Albert I of Belgium visited a battlefield in his shattered kingdom. Appalled by the scenes of ruin and slaughter, the king ordered an iron shell casing found on the battlefield to be cast into 4 watch cases. He intended to present the watches to the 4 individuals who he felt had made the most significant contribution to peace. One watch went to Field Marshal Ferdinand Foch, head of the Allied Supreme Command. Another was given to General John J. Pershing, Commander-in-Chief of the American Expeditionary Force. The third watch was presented to France's Premier, Georges Clemenceau, for his inspiring leadership in the dark days of war. But King Albert did not find anyone qualified to receive the 4th watch. When King Albert died, it was passed on to his son, King Leopold III. In 1970, half a century after the end of World War I, King Leopold presented this 4th watch to Herbert W. Armstrong. In accepting it, Mr. Armstrong said, "I feel it was the highest honor the king could have paid anyone. Whatever contribution to world peace I may be making is not through war, but through education, teaching millions worldwide the way to peace." The 20th century has been a time of paradox, the most progressive and yet the most destructive decades in all history. Great advances have been made in science, engineering, architecture, medicine. Knowledge has exploded in nearly every field of human endeavor. And yet mankind is still losing the battle against the age-old curses of poverty, ignorance, superstition, and war. A few men have cavorted in triumph in the dust of the moon, but millions still languish in despair in the dust of the earth. Even as we forge ahead with brilliant progress and incredible inventions, we edge ever closer to a disaster which would make the earth once more without form and void. Is this how it will end? This century of great advancement?
And now the weapons exist for the first time in all history when they can snuff out every life of every man, woman, and child on this earth. They can just blast all humanity off the earth until not one of us would be left alive. If some idiot, and he would be an idiot, sets off the nuclear explosion, and today you know that several nations, several smaller nations, have nuclear weapons. And they could start it, and it would go to Russia and the United States and the big nations, and finally there wouldn't be any humanity left. Most of us are asleep, and we don't realize what's going on all over the world. I am a voice crying out in the wilderness, the Babylon of religious confusion, of educational chaos and materialism, of political confusion and trouble in the governments of the world, all arming to have war and more war, in a society that is bankrupt, in an economic system that is bankrupt, in that kind of a system. And I'm here to bring you the truth. So I ask you to open your ears and to listen, because you don't hear this from any other voice. Why do we have these?
Herbert Armstrong has been a voice of sanity in these decades of confusion.
World leaders have said.
He has traveled the world, meeting heads of state of many nations. He has met the only two ruling emperors since the end of World War I, Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia and Emperor Hirohito of Japan. He has also met with presidents and prime ministers of many nations: the United Kingdom, Kenya, India, Israel, the Philippines, and Indonesia. He has also met all 7 prime ministers of Japan since 1970. Mr. Armstrong explains the true cause of mankind's troubles, why, in spite of the great progress in physical knowledge, the nations of the world cannot find the way to lasting peace.
I've been coming to Japan now for many years. I'm a little hoarse tonight. You'll have to excuse me. I was speaking quite a while last night to many readers of our magazine, The Plain Truth, and I find that I'm a little hoarse. But as I was telling them last night, I have seen so many things happen in this world in the almost 90 years that I have lived. I have seen miraculous things happen. I have seen awesome progress. But also I have seen appalling troubles and evils happening in the world, and it is becoming worse all the time. I have to ask why. Why the paradox of awesome progress on awesome accomplishments, sending men to the moon and back, jet plane travel, the miracle of television, the many things that we have today, and still so many troubles and so much sorrow and sickness all over the world.
Mr. Armstrong has carried a message of warning and of hope to leaders in every corner of the world. His relentless efforts to explain the true meaning behind world conditions have earned him the title Unofficial Ambassador for World Peace. In the remote Himalayan kingdom of Nepal, two great Eastern religions coexist. It is the only Hindu kingdom in the world, as well as the birthplace of Buddhism. In the Kathmandu Valley, hundreds of gods are an age-old testimony to the dominant role religion plays in the people's way of life.
It has given me a great honor and privilege to introduce such a great man who is visiting our country. A person like Mr. Herbert W. Armstrong. This gentleman, from all his life, has one ambition and one thought, and that is peace in the world. There should be peace, no war.
They've called me an unofficial ambassador for world peace, and so I am. But let me say that there has to be a reason why we don't have peace. And you cannot have peace until there is something that will cause that peace. And there has to be a reason why something has caused us to have just the opposite of peace in this world today. And I'm afraid so many don't understand that. Now, in the world today, there are many different ideologies and philosophies and religions, and everybody seems to think that their own, of course, is the right one and the only one that is true and correct. And I did not come to bring any religion or philosophy or ideology, but just to state a few facts that are facts. We do not have peace and will not have peace until human nature has been changed.
Herbert W. Armstrong is able to survey the 20th century from a unique perspective. In his long life, he has seen the coming of the inventions that have made possible the modern age: the airplane, radio and television, the computer, space travel. Inventions that have changed our world, but not our thinking. In his lifetime, there have been two major attempts by the nations to bring about world peace. After World War I, the victors formed the League of Nations. Hopes were high that the world's governments could now act collectively to prevent war. But the League failed. It was unable to restrain the aggression by the fascist dictators in the 1930s. In June 1945, Mr. Armstrong, as an accredited press representative, was present at the signing of the United Nations Charter at Herbst Theater in San Francisco. The United Nations was a sincere effort to preserve the peace by a world tired of war. But the nations have continued to fight, oblivious to the only way to halt the endless cycles of death and destruction.
Now, I'm not going out to crusade and just stop all wars. I can't do that. I have enough sense to know that I can never do that. and there is no man on earth who can. It is only the great Creator who can, and it's because we do not rely on the Creator for the knowledge of how to live and how to do, and because we just look to ourselves, that we find we're helpless before our problems. The world does not know how to live because it does not rely on the great Creator that is above all the gods and above all that is worshipped, above all of the ideas of human beings. But most human beings know nothing of that God. I can just tell you that
Mr. Armstrong is an ambassador from a kingdom that is not of this world, with a message about government,
he is going to
law, war and peace, and the plan of God. That plan and the course of events that have led to our dangerous modern world were outlined long ago in the much misunderstood prophecies of the Bible. Over 4,000 years ago, God made a promise to the faithful patriarch Abraham. Because Abraham had obeyed him, God would raise up from him a chosen people who would become a model nation. If they would be faithful and obey God, he would bless them above all the nations of the earth. God kept his promise. He brought the descendants of Abraham's grandson Israel out of slavery in Egypt and revealed to them a way of life, 10 great commandments, and laws, statutes, and judgments that would allow them to live in peace and safety in the promised land. The chosen people rose to the peak of their power and influence in the days of King Solomon. But after his death, they split into two, a northern kingdom of Israel, dominated by the descendants of Israel's son Joseph, and the southern kingdom of Judah. And they forgot their God. The northern kingdom continued for 2.5 centuries, sinking ever further into idolatry until in the 8th century BC, God allowed his people to be conquered and taken into captivity by the armies of the Assyrian Empire. The southern kingdom struggled on for 120 more years, but eventually, ignoring the warnings of the great prophets, Judah suffered the same fate. In 585 BC, Jerusalem fell to the Babylonian emperor Nebuchadnezzar, and the inhabitants of Judah were led into exile. Jerusalem was in ruins, and the promised land laid waste. It seemed as if the promise had been broken. But God had not forgotten his people or his plan. In Babylon, a young Jewish captive, Daniel, is summoned before Nebuchadnezzar to interpret a strange dream that had troubled the Babylonian emperor.
You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. This image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth.
Then Daniel explained the meaning of Nebuchadnezzar's dream.
You, O king, are a king of kings, for the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. You are this head of gold. But after you shall arise another kingdom, inferior to yours. Then another, a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron. And like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all the others. Whereas you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. Yet the strength of the iron shall be in it. So the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever.
In one startling prophecy, God had outlined the course of world events for thousands of years into the future. During the next few years, God continued to give Daniel details of the four great empires that would dominate history. After a startling dream, Daniel awoke to write down the frightening revelation.
I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and four great beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other. The first was like a lion, and had eagle's wings. I watched till its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and a man's heart was given to it. And suddenly another beast, a second, like a bear. It was raised up on one side, and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And they said thus to it, Arise, devour much flesh. After this I looked, and there was another, like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns.
Daniel laid a foundation, but he was not given full understanding. That would not come until many centuries had passed, and the world was in the tumultuous age spoken of in prophecy as the time of the end. When that time came, God would raise up another servant who would take a message to all the world, a world on the brink of destruction.
And God has sent me to the kings and to the tops of nations even. And this gospel of the kingdom is going to all the world. Now what is going to happen? The hydrogen bomb has come. And you will read back in Ezekiel, the 6th chapter, that all of the great cities are going to be leveled and destroyed. I'm telling you that a time more terrifying than anything that ever happened is soon going to happen in this world. It's time we wake up. It's time we get our eyes open. We have lost God. We have forgotten God. And God is going to step in. Satan is ruling this dark world, and it's an unhappy world. And God has sent me to preach this gospel. The other ministers, the other churches are not preaching that gospel of Jesus Christ. They preach about Christ, but they don't preach his message. They preach about the messenger, but they don't preach the messenger's message. They ask Christ what will be the end of the world. The end of the world is when this gospel of the kingdom is preached, and you are seeing it. You're seeing me here, I'm preaching it.
This work that has grown into international scope began in 1934. The 30s were difficult times. The United States and Europe were in the grip of the Great Depression. In Germany, a madman had begun to lead his nation down the road to ruin. In 1934, although most did not recognize it, the world was entering the time of the end. Far from the center of turmoil, in the quiet Willamette Valley of western Oregon, God was leading Herbert W. Armstrong to understand the significance of these times. In his autobiography, Mr. Armstrong tells how his eyes were opened to see that the prophecies of the Bible had an urgent message for the modern world. Herbert W. Armstrong was being prepared for a vitally important mission. When God uses human instruments to do his work, things start small. To begin with, there was just Mr. and Mrs. Armstrong and a group of humble co-workers. But God was beginning to lay the foundation for a powerful last witness to the nations of the world. Using the experience gained in business, Mr. Armstrong organized the work into a three-point plan: a weekly radio program, a monthly magazine, and a continuing series of personal lectures and campaigns. The World Tomorrow grew from one program on a 100-watt station to a radio and television program that is now heard and seen on hundreds of stations around the world. From an even humbler beginning, the plain truth has steadily increased in quality and circulation until today it reaches into nearly every country on earth in many languages with a readership of millions. The third part of the three-point plan also began small. Mr. Armstrong held meetings in rented halls in the towns and villages of the Willamette Valley. As the work grew, he planned campaigns in other parts of the United States and eventually overseas. But God had even bigger plans for this part of the three-point plan. The turning point came in 1968. As the world moved closer to its date with destiny, God thrust his servant into the international arena. Like so many other major advances in God's work, it began with a series of apparent coincidences.
It will be 20 years this year that we have been associated with Herr and Frau Hennig. We got to know them years ago at Bonn because of a visit of Mr. Manescu, who was the foreign minister of Romania. And something very interesting developed later, and maybe Frau Hennig would like to tell us that story.
Yes, we were looking for a particular camera. I don't quite remember which type, but in any available in Germany, and Mr. Schnee pointed out that maybe in Belgium or America. Anyway, we drove to Belgium because we had an acquaintance there who has a wholesale camera business, and we asked him. And he told us that he thought he could get this camera for us. Both we and Mr. Schnee wanted one. And then we stayed on a while until we were able to get a camera. And Herr Roland invited us to join him for a cup of coffee in his private apartment upstairs. Upon that occasion, something very special happened. Maybe you would like to tell that, Mr. Schnee.
Yes. Herr Roland, during this visit, handed me a stack of photographs. And I was looking at these photographs, and as coincidence would have it, just before this, Dr. Hay had given me the job of looking for color pictures because the Plain Truth magazine had just gone to full color, and we were desperate to get all kinds of color pictures. So I thought, well, these pictures would be wonderful. There were so many really good shots from all over the world. And I said to Herr Roland when he came back into the room, we would certainly like to buy some of these pictures for our magazines. And he sort of smiled knowingly and shook his head. He said, no, he said, you won't be able to buy these pictures. And I said, well, why not? He said, well, these were taken by King Leopold of Belgium. And he said, one thing, a king could not get involved in a commercial venture. But secondly, he said, anyway, he uses all of his photos for his own publications. And I remember saying, well, I still mean what I say. We could use these pictures for our publications. And I had almost forgotten about the incident when about a week or 10 days later, suddenly the telephone rang. And Herr Roland was on the other side, quite excited. Herr Schnee, I've just come from the king. And the king says that he wants to meet you and talk to you about his photographs. And he would be willing to sell them to Ambassador College. But he said, before you come, could you bring something over so that I could go to the king and explain to him what Ambassador College is, the Plain Truth magazine, and who this man Herbert Armstrong is? And I said, certainly, I'll come right over tomorrow. And when I went, this time I took the 1966 envoy with me. Now this was in 1968. And the biggest envoy that had appeared to that time was this 1966 issue. And I took this envoy and I went through it page by page with Herr Roland and described to him what Ambassador College is and the work of God and Mr. Armstrong and what our goals are, what we hope to accomplish and so on. And the next day, Herr Roland then went to the king and explained the envoy to him as good as he could after I had shown him the envoy. Then Herr Roland came back to me, and Herr Roland said, after seeing the envoy, the king would rather meet Mr. Armstrong. Of course, my vanity wasn't hurt, except maybe a little. But he said, King Leopold wants to meet the man that has raised up this fine college. Yes. And so I had a tiger by the tail now, because I had not even told Mr. Armstrong anything of what had gone before. So I called him up. He happened to be in England at the time. And I remember my opening sentence was, I hope I haven't done anything wrong, Mr. Armstrong. And he said, oh, what have you been into now? And I said, well, Mr. Armstrong, we have an invitation for you to meet King Leopold. And then I went on to explain how it all came about, and he said, well, you haven't done anything wrong. But he said, I'm not sure I'm going to go. I'm going to look into it first. And then about a week later he said, well, I've got all the facts. And he said, I've decided to go, so you can tell King Leopold we would be happy to accept his invitation. It was quite a thrill to go with Mr. Armstrong into the king's palace and to be received by his servants. We were ushered into a waiting room, and then within a few minutes we were brought into a large drawing room. I remember the king sitting at a small coffee table with chairs of padded furniture, very elegant. The king motioned us to come near and greeted us, shook hands, and asked us to sit down. And then quite a shock came, because the opening sentence that the king spoke was, Mr. Armstrong, why have you come to see me? And I thought, well, ghastly, doesn't he know he has invited him? What have I gotten Mr. Armstrong into? But Mr. Armstrong, very calm and collected, just said, well, I understand that you've had a look at our 1966 envoy describing Ambassador College, and that Herr Schnee has shown that we have an interest in your color photographs, and that you have actually invited me to come here. And the king said, yes, that's right. And a few more sentences were exchanged, and it seemed a very short while, and the king said, well, let's go down to my hobby room and let's look at some of my favorite slides. And I remember he showed us about 125 color slides, again from all over the world. And of course Mr. Armstrong was really elated to think that we could have such photographs for the Plain Truth magazine. And it was soon after this first visit that Mr. Armstrong made to King Leopold that he was invited back again. And Herr Roland told us later that it was a rare thing that a guest would be invited on the second visit already to meet the family and to have dinner with the family. Finally, I remember King Leopold visiting our college in Bricket Wood in England, and then later visiting the college at Pasadena and speaking to the student body. And of course, a very deep friendship developed. And then from there, the King Leopold introduced Mr. Armstrong to other personages in high office, and Mr. Armstrong began visiting leaders all over the world. And it's so hard to believe now, but you can see that God always provides the right people at the right time. Just because of a camera we needed, we went to Belgium and we met Herr Roland, and just because of this remark that I made about these photographs that Herr Roland handed me, and because of the need of them for the Plain Truth magazine, we saw this whole thing develop into Mr. Armstrong going to leaders all over the world as an ambassador for world peace.
Since that first meeting in 1968, God has brought Mr. Armstrong before many of the world's most powerful and influential men and women. The walls of Mr. Armstrong's study in Pasadena are lined with mementos of those visits, gifts from the leaders of great nations and small. Some are still in office. Others are no more, victims of old age, of political intrigue, or sometimes the assassin's bullet. Sincere leaders like Anwar Sadat of Egypt, whose dreams of peace were ahead of the violent times in which he lived.
Incidentally, Mr. President, I want to say one thing right straight from the heart. I respect and admire you more than I can tell you, because you have risked everything in an effort for peace, and your heart has to be in it, and it has to be genuine, and not many will do that. I meet heads of state all over the world, but I have not known one that would risk what you did of acquiring the enmity of the Arab world in order to have peace. Now that takes courage, and you had it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And I'm going to let the world know it, because I reach a part of the world.
Very good. Very good.
Less than a year later, Anwar el-Sadat lost his life for the peace he sought. Shortly after the assassination of President Sadat, Mr. Armstrong returned to Egypt.
I was out to the memorial yesterday where President Sadat lies buried. I did give a little salute, and I just said quietly, well, goodbye, my friend.
But leadership must continue, and the reins of government were passed on to the new Egyptian president, Hosni Mubarak. During this trip, Mr. Armstrong met with the new leader of Egypt.
I'm not in politics. I'm an observer. I just look on. I represent God, Allah, and all people. Not any one nation, not any one religion, not any one government. But I'm a friend of all, and I work for peace among all nations. And that is a contribution to peace. And as I say, we are not going to be able to bring peace ourselves. It'll be brought to us.
In the cause of world peace, no region of the world is more crucial than the Middle East. This is the arena in which the fate of civilization will one day be settled. Mr. Armstrong has traveled often in this troubled area. He has kept friendly ties with leaders of both sides of the conflict, such as King Hussein of Jordan, President Suleiman Frangieh of Lebanon, Prime Minister Hedi Nouira of Tunisia, and Prime Ministers Golda Meir, Yitzhak Rabin, and Menachem Begin of Israel. Focal point of the Middle East's troubles is Jerusalem, holy city for three of the world's great religions, and center of contention in the long struggle between the Arab and Israeli people. Mr. Armstrong travels frequently to this pivotal city.
Well, I think I've met every prime minister of Israel since 1968, and every president.
Well, I'm sure that all of them, including myself, appreciate very much what you are doing for this city, old and new, to excavate, to participate, and God bless you.
How do you foresee conditions here in the Middle East now, in the immediate future?
I think we have a chance to break through the wall of belligerency. It's a very complicated business, but after a very long interval, there is a chance, and I think it is for us responsible people not to miss it. Not to miss it.
Do you think that...
Mr. Armstrong discussed the problems that the Middle Eastern leaders face in their quest for peace, including the role of Israel's close neighbor, King Hussein of Jordan.
I think the king knows where he wants to arrive, but he didn't find yet a way to do so.
I know he would like to have peace with you.
I think so. Yes.
I think last time I saw him was 2 years ago, and Mr. Begin was prime minister. I said to King Hussein, I would like to bring Mr. Begin over here in my airplane and have you come out to the plane, and my crew and myself and all of us would leave and leave you two on the plane and get acquainted. I know Mr. Begin well enough. I believe he would be glad to do it. And I know you would too, Your Majesty, if. And he began to laugh and he says, yes, you're right, I would, if. But he would like to, if he could.
I think so, yes. I think that he has his eyes set on peace, but he has to negotiate many difficulties.
I hope you have the breakthrough that you spoke of.
We shall try very hard.
Thank you very much.
We owe it to our friends and to our posterity. We owe it. We shall try very hard.
Well, I can tell you this much. We're going to have more troubles all over the world. In the end, we're going to have world peace. It isn't going to come right away, though. And it isn't going to come easy.
Jerusalem is a city that has rarely known peace. Human passion and religious fervor ensure that prophecy must take its inevitable course. And in the hills and valleys that surround Jerusalem, civilization will be brought to its knees. But God's work can focus on the future, when Jerusalem will be the center for worldwide peace and cooperation. Through the Ambassador Foundation, Mr. Armstrong has worked with Jerusalem's leaders to provide centers where Jewish and Arab children can learn to live, play, and work in peace. It is a significant effort, showing in a practical way that peace can never come until a generation of children have been prepared for a way of life other than war. Mr. Armstrong worked with Mayor Teddy Kollek in supporting the children's playground in Liberty Bell Park that was established during America's bicentennial. In recognition of his contribution to the welfare of the city's people, Mayor Teddy Kollek presented Mr. Armstrong with a token of appreciation.
Yeah. Well, President Armstrong, all your life you have been a fighter of giant lies and of giant untruth. And as you regard yourself a descendant of David, and rightly so, here in the city of David, we would like to present you with this symbolic sculpture in silver and gold of David with his slingshot defeating Goliath. The stories of the Bible are better known to you than to anybody around this table. But here it assumes particular symbolism and particular content. And Mr. Ravid reminded us of the children storming you and appraising you for what you did there, or if it's the very recent contemporary history of helping ICCY with their daily programs. And I'm sure you'll continue with many of these things, but here we are mainly to thank you and proffer you this symbolic gift, which says it all just by looking at it. Thank you very much.
Mr. Armstrong then reminded his hosts of the key role that Jerusalem plays in world events, now and in the future.
Jerusalem is a city with a very remarkable history, more than almost any other city. The eternal God himself says that this city is destined to become the greatest city in the world and in fact in the whole universe. This city is someday going to be the capital of the universe, because this city is going to exist forever. It may still undergo some more changes, but it's going to endure. And you can't say that of any other city on earth.
Christ's apostles first preached the gospel to the people of Jerusalem nearly 2,000 years ago. Those first apostles traveled thousands of miles on foot, on horseback, and by sailing boat, preaching the gospel of the kingdom of God throughout the Roman Empire. Today, the message is the same, but the end-time work has a means of transportation that makes it possible to travel more miles in one day than a lifetime of voyaging in the first century. The first airplane to be used by Mr. Armstrong was a Falcon fan jet. This was replaced by the larger and longer range Gulfstream II. The G2 served the work faithfully for 14 years, logging more than 3 million miles. In 1983, it was decided to replace the G2 with the similar but greatly improved Gulfstream III. The G3 was built at the Gulfstream Aerospace Assembly Plant in Savannah, Georgia. Once the mainframe has been assembled, the thousands of parts that make up a modern jet aircraft are carefully installed. The aircraft's systems are thoroughly tested before it leaves the production line.
Roger, Gulfstream 417. Power levels to idle.
Levels and idle, roger.
Okay, start your dry crank.
Right engine motoring over, combine flight and utility coming up.
Roger, select landing gear up. The landing gear up and locked. Observe hydraulic readings as follows. Combine 3,000 pounds, utility 0, flight 1,500.
Gear up, systems read as noted, ready to proceed.
Aileron, rudder, and elevator operated while applying wheel brakes, ground spoilers, and thrust reversers.
Move slow now.
With all systems functioning, the moment comes for the rollout. There are still many more hours of engine and flight tests to be completed. But eventually, it is time to add the finishing touches. In the paint shop, the distinctive Ambassador College color scheme is carefully applied. Meanwhile, in the cabinet shops, the interior fittings are being built. As the interior begins to take shape, Mr. Armstrong visits Savannah to personally inspect the progress on his new office in the sky. Everything must reflect the high standard that people around the world associate with Ambassador College and the work. The G3 can fly at 85% of the speed of sound, about 637 miles per hour. It can travel non-stop for 4,370 miles at an altitude of 40,000 feet. Cabin pressure is maintained at a comfortable 6,000 feet. With its advanced design and sophisticated equipment, the G3 is considered to be the finest medium-sized jet passenger plane in the world. August 19, 1985, the new G3 was flown to the airstrip at the Ambassador College campus in Big Sandy to be delivered to Mr. Armstrong.
very impressive.
Yes, she's a beauty, isn't she? Looks just like the G2. This is 111 Alpha Charlie.
Delivery of the G3 111 Alpha Charlie.
Yes, sir. All ready is all yours.
And so a powerful new tool began its years of service to the work of God. Home base for the G3 is Burbank Airport, 15 miles from Pasadena. The ground crew prepares it for an extended trip to South Asia and the Far East. Baggage and food are loaded aboard, and final preparations are made. After Mr. Armstrong and those traveling with him arrive, Captain Ken Hopke and co-captain Larry Dietrich make a final pre-flight check.
Autopilot, craft change,
Check. APU is Burbank clearance, Gulfstream 111 Alpha Charlie is ready for ATC clearance.
November 111 Alpha Charlie, you're cleared to the Honolulu Airport via the Canoga 5 departure. Fillmore transition. To Fillmore, then flight planned route. Maintain 7,000. Expect flight level 39er within 5 minutes after departure. Departure control frequency 124.6, squawk 0385.
Hey, ready for taxi.
Understand.
Clear right?
Make a right 270 with a time, my friend.
The G3 takes off from Burbank and heads out across the Pacific Ocean. Mr. Armstrong uses the many long hours of flying to catch up on essential writing.
I visit many heads of state all over the world. I probably have visited more heads of government in their own offices than any other man. And so often people ask me, well, what do I talk about? Do I preach Christ to them? Do I try to get them to accept Christ? I think it's about time we understand. If I went in with some message like that, will you give your heart to the Lord? I would be thrown out on my ear. In other nations, in foreign nations where they have different religions, they don't want some other religion coming in.
Yes, sir, it's right here.
I have to use a little more wisdom. What do I talk about? I talk about the conditions that they're confronted with. I talk about world conditions and problems that are far greater than they themselves are able to cope with. I talk about the cause of these conditions. I go as an ambassador, an unofficial ambassador for world peace, and they receive me as an ambassador for world peace. But I have to tell them why we don't have peace. I have to show them how peace is going to come and why we don't have it. Now, actually, the cause is the violation of God's law. Do I talk to them about God's law? Do I talk to them about sin? Of course I do, but I don't use those terms. I don't talk as a religious man. So I talk to them in language they understand. And so I talk about giving and about loving and being concerned for the welfare of others as well as yourself. And this world is built on the philosophy of get. Everyone wants to get for himself. And that's what's causing all of the troubles in the world. And you know, that makes sense to heads of state. They're practical men. They see these things about them all the time. And they begin to listen when I talk about those things. Do I talk about the kingdom of God? Yes, I do. And God is going to intervene. And sometimes I tell them that straight out. So many of them get the message, and they do understand.
After many hours of flying, the pilots prepared to land in Beijing, capital of the People's Republic of China.
Beijing Tower, November 111, Alpha Charlie for landing Beijing.
November 111, Alpha Charlie. You are clear to land runway 36. Surface wind is 350 at 10.
Roger, clear to land, 11 Alpha Charlie.
Mr. Armstrong was met by an official delegation from the Soong Ching Ling Foundation and the Chinese People's Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries. Later that day, at a reception, Mr. Armstrong was welcomed by Madam Kang Kijing, who is considered to be China's First Lady. A key event in Mr. Armstrong's 6-day visit was a meeting with China's most prominent leader, Deng Xiaoping, in the Great Hall of the People. China is undertaking a sweeping modernization program. Great progress has been made in this huge country in the last 35 years, but China still has a long way to go in achieving success and prosperity for her vast population. Deng Xiaoping has been frank in admitting that mistakes have been made, and under his leadership, China is making important changes as they prepare for the last decade of the 20th century and beyond.
Just across the way.
Mr. Armstrong is also frank in telling his Chinese hosts the root cause of humanity's problems and the ultimate change in direction that must be made before any nation can have lasting peace.
I would just like to say that we're living in a world of contrasts, a world of awesome progress, advancement in technology, in engineering, in production of every kind, and yet at the same time, a world that is filled with evils, and the evils are multiplying more rapidly than the progress. Why do we live in such a world? Why cannot we solve all of the problems? Why cannot we have world peace? I can answer in just 2 words: human nature.
我的回答就是2个字，这就是人性。
Human nature.
Human nature always seeks to get and to take, but has no concern for the good of others. If we're going to have real world peace, we will have to overcome that tendency of human nature.
An important contribution towards peace is to teach tomorrow's leaders the way of cooperation and service. China has hundreds of millions of children. As chairman of the Ambassador Foundation, Mr. Armstrong has established a working relationship with Chinese organizations dedicated to serving youth. Several months before Mr. Armstrong's visit to China, the Ambassador Foundation sponsored children from the Children's Palace in Shanghai on a tour of several American cities. They had stayed on the Ambassador campus and visited with Mr. Armstrong at his home. During his trip to China, Mr. Armstrong visited the Shanghai Children's Palace, where talented children are taught a variety of cultural skills. The reunion with his Chinese grandchildren was a highlight of a busy week. At a banquet in Shanghai's Jinjiang Club, Mr. Armstrong delivered a parting address.
The world is now threatened with nuclear war, and all of the experts admit that if a nuclear war starts, it can never be stopped.
现在世界上面临着核战争的威胁，专家们都认为，一旦核战争爆发了，就无法停止这样的战争的。
And if a nuclear war is not stopped, it would erase all human beings off this earth. An important business magazine in the United States carried an editorial which said it would seem that the only hope of humanity now lies in the sudden appearance and intervention of a strong hand from someplace. The editor who wrote that was referring to the Creator God who created all mankind. And I tell you tonight, by his authority, that he will intervene and will save humanity, and we will have world peace.
我今天晚上想告诉你们，只有上帝的权威才能加以干预，才能给世界带来和平。
But when the great Creator does intervene and rule all nations on the earth, he is going to begin teaching us peace by working with the little children.
After leaving China, Mr. Armstrong and his party traveled on to several other Asian countries. He was also invited to visit the leaders of the beautiful but troubled island of Sri Lanka, located in the Indian Ocean off the southern tip of India. Sri Lanka should be a blessed land. With its small population and abundant resources, the nation has been able to avoid some of the problems that other nations in this poverty-stricken region must struggle against. Sri Lanka has embarked on an ambitious development scheme to harness the waters of the nation's largest river and open up thousands of acres of arid land for settlement and cultivation. Mr. Armstrong was asked by the Sri Lankans to view this vast project, now in the final stages of completion.
Sri Lanka is the only developing.
Later, he discussed Sri Lanka's development with President Junius Jayawardena.
I want to see the
The President explained that in spite of spectacular progress, Sri Lanka is going through a time of trouble. Separatists, seeking their own state in the north, have engaged in several acts of terrorism. Hundreds have been killed and wounded, and the calm of this tropical island paradise has been shattered. The Sri Lankans have learned that material development of itself does not bring peace. Man can find a way to control the power of mighty rivers, but he cannot stop the tide of anger, resentment, and contention that flows from human hearts. In a lively press conference with Sri Lankan radio, TV, and newspaper reporters, Mr. Armstrong explained why the nation could not find peace.
Well, all our problems are caused by human nature. And human nature is essentially selfish. Now, I can explain those things, and I can say that it comes from self-interest, from the spirit of competition, always from the point of view of the interest of oneself or one's party or one's race or one's religion or whatever one is a member of. But we're living in a competitive world. We're living in a world that is based fundamentally on the philosophy of get. And so we still do not have peace because people do not know the way to peace. The way to peace is having concern for your fellow man. The way to peace is love. The way to peace is cooperation and helping one another and having a loving concern for the good of other people. And that gets into human nature. Now, I cannot change human nature. I can talk about it and I can explain and I can give the reason. But every one of you must make up your own mind what you're going to do. I can't make up your mind for you. And that's the same with everybody else on earth. I can't make up the minds of other people. I can only make up my mind what I want to do. But I can explain the truth and the cause of wars and the way to world peace. And it will not come until mankind comes to have love for his neighbor. And today, man doesn't love his neighbor. Nation doesn't love other nations, they love their own nation. And so we have competition, and that leads to, often, to war, and individuals come to what you're having here right now, the kind of violence has come into terrorism. And terrorism comes in the same way as war, from a wrong attitude of mind, a wrong desire of just selfishness and of opposition toward other people and wanting to use force of some kind to have your own way against other people. I don't have a magic wand. I can't wave a magic wand and just say the world has peace. You can't bring it about that way. I have to look at the facts as they are. And the facts are human nature.
But I feel what you have just said is only philosophy and does not offer any solution to our problems. How will that produce peace now?
It won't produce peace now. I'm just telling you the facts that what will produce peace. And I say to you that we human beings are not going to produce peace. I think that all religions, at least, know that there is a higher power. Many of them don't know what that higher power is. They don't have it defined, perhaps, because they don't know. But there is a higher power, and that higher power is going to have to come and bring us peace. We're not going to bring peace, but the great Creator, God, is going to have to intervene and bring us peace if He has to force it upon us. And that's the way peace is finally going to come.
As for Sri Lanka, we have prayed to God to solve our ethnic problem. But I don't think even God can promote peace in this country.
I say to you that God could intervene right now. But that is not His will to do that, and He is not, I can tell you that, He is not going to intervene right now. He's going to let us learn some lessons. Human beings do not know that they should love their fellow man. And so we go about loving our own selves instead of our fellow man. And God is going to let us punish ourselves and bring about wars and kill so many people. It will come to the place where we would destroy every man, woman, and child on the face of the earth. The weapons of mass destruction now exist. The United States has them. The Soviet Union has them. France has them. China has them. Other nations are beginning to have nuclear weapons. And a nuclear war could erase all human life from this earth. And conditions are going to come, and men are going to go on fighting one another, and men are going to go on. I can't change their minds, and no other man can change their minds. And men are going to have to learn that lesson. They're going to come to the place where they would destroy the last man and woman and child on earth. Then the supreme God is going to intervene before that happens. And He is not going to intervene until we learn our lesson. Humanity won't learn. I can tell you the way to peace, but you won't believe me. You men right here won't believe me. The world won't believe me. And I can't bring peace unless you would believe me, and you won't. I'm speaking very plainly. I represent that higher power. And I know what He proposes. And I know what He is going to do. And He won't do it until we have punished ourselves to the place where we're willing to submit to Him. The trouble is, neither side in this problem that you're having here right now is willing to submit to that higher power. And as long as you won't, you're going to fight and have trouble. And we're going to have to come to the place where we have to rely on Him to do it for us.
In Colombo, the capital city, Mr. Armstrong explained the purpose of the Ambassador Foundation to Sri Lankan Prime Minister Ranasinghe Premadasa.
I'm sure you understand that the Ambassador Foundation is not religious.
I do.
It's neither political nor religious. It's separate. It is supported by the church.
Yes.
But it is not religious in itself at all. And even the church is not proselyting and is not seeking members. And so we have nothing to gain. but perhaps we may have something to give.
Right, right. And the more you give, you gain.
That's right. Well, as has been said, it's more blessed to give than to receive.
That is so.
And I find that is actually true.
If you endeavor to gain, you won't get anything.
I think that's the basis of the trouble in the world.
Right.
The people in the world are all trying to gain and to get.
Greed.
And not to share or to give. But sharing and giving is by far better.
That's right.
And will lead to peace instead of troubles. If people had more concern for others than themselves, and we weren't competitive, but we were cooperative and helpful to one another, we'd have peace.
We are very thankful to you for taking time off to visit our country and discuss matters with us, and for the great service you are rendering to mankind.
After leaving Sri Lanka, the G3 flew across the Bay of Bengal to Thailand.
And brethren, we'll pick up there tomorrow with Mr. Armstrong's visit to the land part of Thailand. We're out of time for today for this live stream for the 4th day of the Feast of Tabernacles on the 18th day of the 7th month on God's sacred calendar, the 8th day of October 2017, Sunday on the pagan Roman calendar. Thanks for joining us, brethren. Have a wonderful rest of the day on this 4th day of the Feast of Tabernacles. We're in between, we're in the lull, in between the storm, and where I am in the Birmingham, Alabama area, we're expecting in the next few minutes for the first parts of this storm. We're already seeing a little bit of the wind, and we're expecting the first parts of this storm to roar on through. You know, it reduced from a Category 1 once it hit land down to just a tropical storm, but tornadoes can spin off of these tropical storms. Tropical Storm Nate. It's due up in Tennessee area at about 7 o'clock tonight. Any of you who may be watching who are in the Tennessee area, the eye of the storm is to be coming into your area about 7 o'clock tonight. Then it continues on up through a northeastern swing from there. Or I should say northeastern swing from there. All right, brethren, we'll pick up right here tomorrow, and we'll have a few more things and some, hopefully I've got some nice surprises for you tomorrow on the 5th day of the Feast of Tabernacles. We're now nearing 600 years into the millennium, symbolically from where we are at this point in the Feast of Tabernacles on this 4th day of the feast for 2017. Thanks for joining me, brethren. Happy Feast of Tabernacles. Chag Sameach. Stevie Lloyd Gilbert. Catch you later.